July 22, 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 11:30 p.m. Hung heavy with humidity, thick as cotton against the skin. North 25th Street stretched beneath the glow of sodium streetlights, casting amber shadows across cracked pavement. Two Milwaukee Police Department patrol officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, noticed a figure stumbling toward them, shirtless, one wrist trailing a silver handcuff that caught the light with each jerking movement. The young black man's eyes were wide, pupils dilated, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His name was Tracy Edwards. He pointed behind him, toward a low-rise apartment complex with faded brick facades. "Apartment 213, he said. The man inside had threatened him with a knife, had tried to kill him. The officers exchanged glances. Domestic dispute, perhaps. Intoxication. Standard protocol dictated they investigate. They followed Edwards back toward the building, unaware they were walking toward an abyss that would redefine American serial murder, that would force a reckoning with institutional failure, with the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities, with the question of how evil can hide in plain sight for 13 years. The Oxford Apartments stood unremarkable in a working-class neighborhood where residents kept to themselves, where the smell of industrial yeast from the nearby breweries mixed with exhaust fumes and the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 94. This was a neighborhood of transients, of people arriving and disappearing, of immigrants seeking work, of young men drifting between jobs and cities. It was the kind of place where screams could go unreported, where strange odors were attributed to bad plumbing, where a quiet blonde man who worked the night shift at the Ambrosia chocolate factory could store a graveyard in his one-bedroom apartment without raising sustained alarm. Inside apartment 213, the officers found Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, 31 years old, blue-eyed, calm, who explained with unsettling composure that Edwards was his boyfriend, that they'd had a disagreement, nothing serious. But the officers noticed the smell, chemical, organic, wrong. They noticed Dahmer's insistence that they not search the bedroom. They noticed the Polaroid photographs scattered on a side table. One officer picked up a photograph. It showed a dismembered human torso. Another showed a skull, stripped clean, photographed like a trophy. The officer looked at Dahmer. Dahmer lunged for his keys. The officers wrestled him to the floor. And when they opened the refrigerator, they found a human head wrapped in plastic, eyes open, staring back at them with the vacant expression of the dead. What followed in the next 72 hours was an excavation of horror. Milwaukee Police Department investigators, FBI forensic specialists, and medical examiners worked in rotating shifts inside apartment 213, wearing respirators and protective suits, cataloging evidence that seemed to belong to a nightmare rather than a Milwaukee suburb. They found 4 severed heads in the refrigerator and freezer. They found a stock pot containing decomposed hands and a penis. They found a 57-gallon blue plastic drum filled with acid and 3 partially dissolved torsos. They found boxes of bones, cleaned and sorted. They found photographs, 84 Polaroids in total, depicting the progressive dismemberment of 17 different young men and boys, each image documenting a stage in Dahmer's ritual. The victim alive, the victim unconscious, the victim dead, the body in pieces. They found skulls painted gray, arranged on shelves. They found a freezer containing a human heart. The apartment measured barely 300 square feet. Every surface, every container, every drawer held evidence of systematic murder. Milwaukee had believed itself immune to this scale of depravity. The city prided itself on Midwestern stability, on beer and bratwurst, on Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Lake Michigan sunsets. But on July 23, 1991, Milwaukee woke to headlines that would echo across the world. House of Horror, Milwaukee Cannibal, the monster next door. The remains of 11 victims were identified within days. Eventually, Dahmer would confess to 17 murders spanning from 1978 to 1991. The victims believed they were entering a transaction. $50 for photographs, a few beers at a stranger's apartment, perhaps a casual sexual encounter. They believed in the basic social contract that governs human interaction. That most strangers are not predators, that locked doors can be opened, that screaming will bring help. Stephen Hicks believed he was accepting a ride from a friendly guy on his way to a rock concert. Anthony Hughes believed he was going home with someone who understood sign language, who saw him as a person rather than a disability. Konarak Synthasamphone believed police officers would protect him when he ran into the street, naked and bleeding. Believed police officers would protect him when he ran into the street, naked, and the victims were predominantly young Black and Southeast Asian men, many of them gay or questioning their sexuality, many of them economically vulnerable, many of them living on the margins of a city that had already decided their lives were expendable. Dahmer understood this. He selected victims from bus stations, gay bars, shopping malls, places where young men congregated without community oversight, where disappearances could be attributed to choice rather than violence. He offered money. He offered companionship. He offered alcohol laced with sleeping pills, and when his victims lost consciousness, he killed them. Then he photographed them. Then he dismembered them. Then he kept parts of them, skulls, hands, genitals, as souvenirs. He told investigators he wanted to create zombies, people who would never leave him, who would remain under his control forever. He drilled holes into the skulls of living victims and poured acid into their brains, attempting crude lobotomies. Most died immediately. One, Konarak Synthasamphone, wandered into the street, brain damaged and bleeding, where 3 Black women found him and called 911. Police officers John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish responded. Dahmer convinced them the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend, just drunk. They returned Konarak to apartment 213. 2 hours later, Dahmer strangled him. The officers never ran Dahmer's name through the database. If they had, they would have discovered he was a registered sex offender convicted of molesting Konarak's older brother 3 years earlier. The investigation into Jeffrey Dahmer became a study in missed opportunities, in institutional failure, in the consequences of prejudice. Milwaukee Police Department records revealed that neighbors had complained repeatedly about strange smells emanating from apartment 213. Dahmer explained he'd had a freezer malfunction. Officers accepted this. In September 1988, Dahmer was arrested for drugging and sexually assaulting 13-year-old Somsak Synthasamphone. He pleaded guilty. His attorney argued that Dahmer was a homosexual in need of treatment, not incarceration. The judge sentenced him to 5 years of probation and 1 year in a work release program. Dahmer served 10 months. His probation officer noted that Dahmer was cooperative and employed. During this probation period, Dahmer murdered 12 people. In May 1991, when police returned Konarak Synthasamphone to Dahmer, despite the protests of 3 Black women witnesses, the officers filed no formal report. They joked about the incident on their radio, saying they'd reunited boyfriend and boyfriend and needed to deloused after entering the apartment. Glenda Cleveland, one of the women who'd called 911, called the police station the next day to follow up. She was told it was a domestic matter, not her concern. She insisted something was wrong. She was dismissed. When Dahmer's crimes were discovered 2 months later, Cleveland's recorded calls became evidence of systemic negligence. The Milwaukee Police Department Chief Philip Areola suspended officers Balcerzak and Gabrish, then fired them. The officers appealed. The Milwaukee Police Association defended them. In 1994, both officers were reinstated with back pay. Balcerzak eventually became president of the Milwaukee Police Association. The forensic investigation revealed patterns that would reshape criminal behavioral analysis. FBI agents reviewed every piece of evidence from apartment 213, conducted DNA analysis on the remains, traced Dahmer's movements across 3 states and Germany, where he'd been stationed with the U.S. Army from 1979 to 1981. They searched for additional victims. They found none abroad, But the timeline within the United States was sufficiently horrific. Dahmer's method evolved across 13 years, becoming more elaborate, more ritualized, more confident. His first victim was Stephen Hicks, 18 years old, killed on June 18, 1978, in Bath Township, Ohio. 3 weeks after Dahmer graduated from Revere High School, Dahmer picked up Hicks while Hicks was hitchhiking to a rock concert. They drank beer at Dahmer's family home, where Dahmer was living alone while his parents finalized a divorce. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a barbell, strangled him, dismembered the body, and buried the remains in the backyard. Dahmer later exhumed the bones, crushed them with a sledgehammer, and scattered them in the woods behind the house. For 9 years, Dahmer did not kill again, or at least no victims from that period have been identified. Then, in September 1987, Dahmer murdered Stephen Tuomi in a Milwaukee hotel room. He claimed he didn't remember the act itself, only waking to find Tuomi dead beside him. He purchased a large suitcase, packed the body inside, transported it to his grandmother's house in West Allis, and dismembered it in the basement. After Tuomi, the killings accelerated. Jamie Doxtator, age 14. Richard Guerrero, age 25. Anthony Sears, age 24. Dahmer moved into his own apartment, apartment 213, in May 1990. From that point until his arrest 14 months later, he murdered 12 people. The blue 57-gallon drum became his signature, a container large enough to dissolve multiple bodies simultaneously using hydrochloric acid. Investigators found residue from 3 torsos in the drum. The Polaroid photographs served as his documentation, his proof, his means of reliving the murders. Forensic psychologists later testified that the photographs also served a practical purpose. Dahmer's memory was impaired by chronic alcoholism, and he used the photos to remember which victims he'd kept and where he'd stored their remains. Detectives working the case found themselves navigating psychological terrain most had never encountered. Milwaukee police detective Dennis Murphy, who conducted Dahmer's initial confession, described sitting across from a man who spoke about murder with the same tone others might use to describe their morning routine. Dahmer was cooperative, articulate, precise. He provided names, dates, methods. He corrected investigators when they misunderstood details. He expressed remorse in abstract terms. "I know what I did was wrong," but demonstrated no emotional response when viewing photographs of his victims alive. Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist hired by the prosecution, interviewed Dahmer extensively. Dietz concluded that Dahmer suffered from paraphilias, specifically necrophilia, but was legally sane. He understood right from wrong. He planned his crimes. He took steps to avoid detection. He lied to police. He disposed of evidence. These actions indicated cognitive awareness and moral understanding, the legal threshold for sanity. Defense psychiatrists disagreed. Dr. Frederick Fosdahl diagnosed Dahmer with borderline personality disorder and psychotic episodes driven by his compulsions. Dr. Judith Becker testified that Dahmer's sexual fantasies about control and possession had become indistinguishable from reality, that he genuinely believed he could create compliant companions from corpses. The trial became a contest between 2 narratives. Was Jeffrey Dahmer a monster who chose evil, or a madman compelled by mental illness? The jury deliberated for 5 hours. On February 15, 1992, they found Dahmer sane. He was convicted on 15 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years total. Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853. Dahmer would die in prison, but not from the state. The blue drum became the symbolic center of the case, appearing in courtroom testimony, in media coverage, in the nightmares of Milwaukee residents. It was unremarkable, a standard industrial drum, the type used to store chemicals or bulk food products. But within the context of apartment 213, it became an altar of methodical destruction. Dahmer purchased it from a hardware store. He filled it with acid. He placed bodies inside and watched them dissolve over weeks, occasionally stirring the mixture. When the process was complete, he poured the liquefied remains down the toilet. The drum was practical, efficient, anonymous. It could be explained away as equipment for photography or home improvement. But for investigators, the drum represented the industrialization of murder, the reduction of human beings to waste products. Dr. Robert Huntington, chief medical examiner for Summit County, Ohio, later described the drum as evidence of destructive hostility, a psychiatric term for rage so profound it seeks to erase the existence of the victim entirely. Dahmer didn't just kill, he obliterated. He dissolved bone, he pulverized teeth, he consumed flesh. The drum was his crucible, and yet Dahmer himself was mundane. Neighbors described him as quiet and polite, a little strange. Co-workers at the Ambrosia chocolate factory said he kept to himself, arrived on time, rarely spoke. His apartment manager noted that Dahmer paid rent consistently, never caused disturbances, though the smell became an issue. Dahmer's ordinariness was part of his camouflage. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's son, someone's co-worker, someone who might sit next to you on a bus. This ordinariness terrified the public more than anything else. If Jeffrey Dahmer could hide among us, who else might be hiding? The case reshaped American law enforcement in ways still evident 3 decades later. The FBI incorporated the Dahmer investigation into training protocols for serial murder cases, emphasizing the importance of interagency communication, of treating missing persons reports seriously, regardless of the victim's demographics, of recognizing that serial killers do not conform to a single profile. Milwaukee Police Department implemented policy changes requiring officers to file formal reports for all welfare checks, to run names through criminal databases during domestic disturbance calls, to photograph individuals claiming to be in relationships with visibly injured or incapacitated persons. The Synthosophone family filed a federal lawsuit against the city, arguing that racial and homophobic bias prevented officers from protecting Conorak. The suit was settled in 1995 for $850,000. Glenda Cleveland, the woman whose 911 calls were ignored, received a symbolic award from the city years later. Too late to save Conorak. Too late to prevent the murders of 5 more young men after that night in May. The case also catalyzed changes in forensic science. DNA analysis in 1991 was still relatively new. The Dahmer case demonstrated its value in identifying victims from fragmentary remains. Dental records, bone analysis, and chemical testing protocols developed during the investigation became standard practice. The Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office was overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. They had to process remains from 11 victims simultaneously, many in advanced stages of decomposition. It was the largest forensic operation in Wisconsin history. The office later published findings in academic journals, contributing to the field of disaster victim identification. But beyond protocols and policies, the Dahmer case forced a cultural conversation about whose lives matter, about which disappearances prompt investigations, and which are dismissed as lifestyle choices. The vast majority of Dahmer's victims were people of color. They were poor. They were gay or perceived as gay. They were immigrants or children of immigrants. They were the people society had already decided not to see. Dahmer understood this. He weaponized it. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He was assigned to the general population despite concerns about his safety. He expressed in interviews that he expected to die in prison, that he didn't fear it. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was cleaning a prison bathroom with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Scarver, serving a life sentence for murder, attacked both men with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer's skull was fractured. He died en route to the hospital. He was 34 years old. Scarver later said he'd been repulsed by Dahmer's crimes and believed Dahmer had taunted him by shaping food into body parts. Prison officials denied this. Scarver also claimed that prison staff had deliberately left the 3 men alone, that Dahmer's death was sanctioned. No investigation substantiated this. Dahmer was buried in West Allis, Wisconsin. His brain was preserved for study at the request of defense attorneys, who hoped posthumous analysis might reveal neurological explanations for his behavior. Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey's father, fought the preservation order. He wanted his son's brain cremated. The court eventually ruled in Lionel's favor. In December 1995, Jeffrey Dahmer's brain was cremated. His ashes were divided between his parents, who had divorced in 1978. Joyce Dahmer, his mother, died in 2000. Lionel Dahmer lived until 2023, spending decades trying to understand what had gone wrong with his son, publishing a memoir titled A Father's Story, giving interviews, searching for warning signs he'd missed. He found none that satisfied him. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Jeffrey Dahmer had hidden in plain sight because society allowed him to, because his victims were not priorities, because the institutions meant to protect failed. The Oxford apartments were demolished in November 1992, 15 months after Dahmer's arrest. The site remained vacant for years, a grass lot in the middle of a neighborhood trying to forget. Residents reported that property values plummeted. Some moved away. Others tried to reclaim the area, to assert that their community was more than one man's crimes. But the shadow remained. In 2005, the lot was still empty. In subsequent years, discussions arose about what to build there. A memorial, affordable housing, a park. Nothing materialized. The land remained as it was. A scar, a silence. A space where 17 lives ended and a city's illusions about itself were shattered. The victims' families received no compensation beyond the lawsuit settlements. Many spoke of being re-traumatized by continued media coverage, by documentaries, by television series that focused on Dahmer rather than the lives he destroyed. Rita Isbell, sister of victim Errol Lindsay, said in 2022 that no one had asked her permission to recreate her victim impact statement in a Netflix series, that watching an actress perform her words felt like reliving it all over again. The families wanted remembrance, but not spectacle. They wanted justice, but justice had failed them long before Dahmer was caught. The systemic failures that allowed Dahmer to kill 17 people were never fully addressed. Officers were reinstated. Policies were updated, but not overhauled. The structural racism and homophobia that rendered Dahmer's victims invisible remained embedded in institutions across the country. What does it mean to confront a case like Jeffrey Dahmer's? It means acknowledging that evil is not always extraordinary, that monsters do not announce themselves, that the people we fail to protect are often the people society has already failed. It means recognizing that Dahmer's victims were human beings with dreams, with families who loved them, with futures that were stolen. Stephen Hicks wanted to be a musician. Anthony Hughes wanted to own a restaurant. Ernest Miller wanted to be a dancer. They are not statistics. They are not Dahmer's victims. They are individuals who deserve to live. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not a story about one man's depravity. It is a story about how depravity flourishes when we look away, when we decide some lives are worth less than others, when institutions prioritize comfort over justice. Milwaukee has never fully reconciled with this. The families have never found peace. And somewhere, in another city, another apartment building stands where someone like Jeffrey Dahmer might be living undetected, counting on society's indifference, counting on the invisibility of his victims. The weight of that possibility is what the Dahmer case leaves behind. Not just horror at what happened, but fear of what might still be happening. That is the legacy. Not the blue drum, not the Polaroids, not the apartment. The legacy is the question. Whose disappearance would we notice? Whose death would demand justice? And whose would we allow to vanish into silence? One more missing person report filed and forgotten.